Welcome, Yashica. This is I do want to say everyone should buy this book. I really really enjoyed reading it. Thank you so much for writing it. And you've talked also about how you've written the book many times over, and that shows. And it's a deeply intimate portrait, but also a searing critique. Excellent social science history, and was a really really rewarding read. I do want to also just stress one thing, which is when you do write your questions down, please do write your names, and also try and keep the handwriting legible for me. I have no business saying this as someone with atrocious handwriting myself. But if you don't want me to willfully or unintentionally misrepresent your questions, then so be it. Yashika, we discussed a little bit in terms of the fact that we'd really like for you to read parts of the book also. But just to start off, let me start off with a question that came to mind because of how deftly you navigate a first person narrative and also social science history through the book. The historical research is rigorous and it's punchy at the same time, which is a rare feat and something all scholars should try and emulate. But the first person narrative is riveting and breathtaking. It's got, it's deeply, deeply intimate. And it's also written with really breathtaking reflexivity in terms of the way you've sort of excavated your past and the emotions around your own life, but also the lives of the people most dear to you, whose stories you tell. And it ends with a touching acknowledgement of a figure who has helped you tell that story. But the pages that precede it are full of candor, and they seem to be both empowering and exhausting at the same time. Um, and so, but I mean, more than anything, I wanted to sort of ask you about the arduous and painstaking process of going from the Facebook post to the book, and to the book in this iteration. How has it been to write it? How has it been to write something that is so intimate for such large audiences across continents? And also, how is it that you see it in the long tradition of narration, of autobiographical narration, that's common to both the Black and the Dalit Bahujan tradition?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. It's a Monday, the most difficult day of the week. So I really appreciate this. Thank you for that terrific question. You talk about reflexivity, and it's the process of questioning your own life history, the way I see it over and over. And for me to be reflexive was easier than to not know the system that we are a part of. Caste is invisible, it is denied over and over. We are told that it doesn't exist. So when you're born as a Dalit untouchable person, when you're born as a Dalit woman in a manual scavenging family like I was, but your material conditions don't correlate to the caste profession that your ancestors were supposed to, that they were tied to, then you're told that caste doesn't exist. And the oppression of the invisible modes of caste, they're just lost to us. So for me, it was extremely empowering to finally have the tools to understand what was going on around me. And you mentioned that the person that I acknowledge at the end of the book, that's my therapist. And I was deeply fortunate that I had access to mental health resources, to therapy, which is something that, first of all, in the subcontinent in South Asia, we just don't have conversations about mental health. They just say, oh, someone's depressed and then they have an issue, that there's something wrong with them. And the trauma of surviving casteism, that's just never talked about. And because I was in therapy, and thankfully I was with a therapist who was, despite being a dominant caste woman, was also able to equip me with the tools to question everything around me. And that led me to just challenge the narratives that I was given throughout my life, which is that caste was over. We were in a post caste world just because India had attained independence in 47. Dr. Ambedkar, Baba Sahib B.R. Ambedkar, had written the constitution. My parents weren't engaged in manual scavenging, even though their grandparents were. And also my family members were. Therefore, I should just be grateful. And that is in reason enough for me to never question caste, despite the fact that it was affecting my life on an everyday basis. So I think reflexivity was deeply empowering, and I would encourage all of us to be more reflexive in our lives, to challenge the norms around us, because it gives us the answers that have been kept away from us. These myths, especially, the project of India is a project of myth making. There are so many myths that exist. And one of the biggest myths, and I want to sort of underscore that again, is that caste doesn't exist, that caste is over. And being reflexive about that aspect of my life allowed me to challenge that. And you talk about Black autobiographies and Dalit autobiographies. The way I think of my work is as of a storyteller, like Ida B. Wells, for example, and which is not to compare, but just to give you a sort of, a person who was a storyteller of their own movement, of their own life, born into slavery, but also had deeply distinct conditions from her own parents, and used the difficult conditions of her own life to shine the light on her entire community. And I feel that when I read her work as a journalist, it was deeply inspiring to me. And it showed me a way of how to create a space myself into this movement that has already existed. We need to understand that Dalit movement is not new. It is hundreds of years old, preceding Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, and since him, so much agitation in Dalit space has happened. But that doesn't mean that there is no space for new narratives, new voices. In fact, there is urgent need, because it's so easy to dismiss the narratives of marginalized people. It's, you register them, you digest them, and you throw them away. And which is why we need more voices. We need all of us to talk about how caste is a violence that affects us in our everyday life.
That's wonderful, and it's also a I think the way in which you present it, part of the written work, and then the way in which the prose flows, and almost occludes the years of work that went into constructing that. If you'd like to share what any of that was like, what the actual process of writing this book and as a book was like, as different from other forms of writing, then I think that's also something all of us would like to hear.
So the book is 5 years old. The fact that I'm sitting here in front of you since 2019, when the first time I was here at Harvard, and in 2023, when my book is finally out in the US, itself speaks volumes. This is a book, like you mentioned in your introduction, has done incredibly well in the South Asian subcontinent. So I think the question is, why did it take so long for me to publish this book? And the fact is, it's because no publisher wanted to publish it. So American publishers in the United States, in particular, I mean, where else would they be? They want to typecast South Asian writers, South Asian women writers, in a very specific voice. And I've been on a book tour, and every time people ask me this question, and I take great joy in saying that I don't want to write about grandmother's bangles and mango orchards and the smell of cooking. Like, that is not something that interests me. But that is the trope that we are supposed to fit in. That is the role of a South Asian woman writer. She's supposed to have a docile voice. She's supposed to be humble. And I don't want to be any of those things. This book isn't any of those things. And where do you take a book like this that doesn't make sense to the American reader? We talk so much about gaze and Western gaze and dominant caste gaze. This book challenges all of those. And while it is great to talk about that, it is also important for us to remember that there is no space for volumes like this. And I'm really grateful that Beacon Press took a chance on it and brought it out to the world. And the impact is here to see. I mean, everywhere I've been, people have received it in this incredible way. So the process of writing this book till 2019 was an entirely different one. I did not think I could write a book because I had no permission to imagine myself as a writer. How many Dalit female writers in English even existed? Very few, none that I knew of. And which is not to say that they didn't. I just didn't know of them. So there was, all popular writers, and think of any name that you can think of, any South Asian female writer, they're not Dalit. So I didn't think I could dare write a book on my story, or the access to the language in a way that South Asian writers are supposed to have. I didn't think I would be given that access. And until I took it for myself, I wrote a Facebook note where I talked about coming out as Dalit, followed it with journalism. And when, the only thing that matters is capital. And when they saw that those stories have traction, that's when that book got published in India. And when publishers here saw that this book has traction, that's when it got published here. So I think the lesson here is that as marginalized writers, we have to be like juggernauts. We have to keep making the way because none exists. And, the process of writing this book was like breaking stones in many ways.
No, and I think now that you say it, it also makes complete sense, because the other thing that you're sort of the 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 gaze with which you approach the question of family is so radically different from the kinds of Booker nominated and shortlisted fiction and non-fictional work that we're becoming accustomed to as sort of as folks who live in North America and consume South Asian or South Asian diasporic literature. But the other thing I think that is also marvelous about the world that you traverse, right, and the worlds you traverse, and the reason why it's special that this book is also different from the original, is what you think readers will get out of it. Those who might have read the first version, but also those who might be thinking of Caste beyond South Asia, and what you have to why should they pick this book up?
Yeah, I think it's very interesting the way we talk about books, and you've said it. It's often been said the way we consume books, the way we consume literature. It's as if words are for consumption. These are not just our life stories. This is not just our pain. This is a product that we are creating. And that's a very disheartening and heartbreaking truth. Ultimately, and I've worked in advertising for a very long time. I've been a journalist. I know how these worlds collide with each other. So, unfortunately, those forces of the market, none of us are above it, which is not to say that I wrote this book keeping that in mind. If I did, this would have been a very different book. I just felt that I have this one shot to write this book and I can write whatever I want. And I know because of the space that I've been successful to create, even before I wrote the book, there will be some traction, right? But as far as writing this book and the way I conceived it, my only idea was that I wanted to make sure that there were bridges that were being constructed. So when this book was in India, I wanted to speak to Dalit readers. I wanted to speak to Dalit people, folks who have never been addressed, folks who have never been the masters of their own stories, the central characters of their own stories. When I brought it to the United States, time had moved on. So much had happened in the caste movement in the US. And I felt like approaching newspapers to write an editorial is just such a difficult job. Any one of us who's tried it will know. And especially as a Dalit writer, South Asian writers are marginalized. South Asian journalists have a difficult time finding space. So imagine how hard it must be for a Dalit writer to say, this is what I want to write, and I don't want to be co opted in the narrative you want me. So there are newspapers who've said, well, if you're writing about this, then you have to also talk about Hindu fundamentalism, whether or not that is a part of the narrative. And sometimes it's, but sometimes it is not. So I wanted to be able to say what I wanted to say on my own terms. And I had the opportunity to do that with a new book. And it's a revised version. It's the same book with additional chapters. So I felt that, here is my chance to make this impact and really give my perspective on how I see the caste movement in the United States the way it is right now.
And to step away from questions also of form and of the novelty of the book, but to situate it also in a different American context. One of the things that that you've discussed also, and I think part of the thing that I found to be very enjoyable in engaging with your work, not just in the form of your articles, in the form of the book, but also in the interviews you've given. And one of these interviews on the Anurag minus Verma podcast, which I think all of you should listen to if you haven't already. Listen, brings up a conversation that you raise of sorts there, which is around the question of what the horizons of Dalit privilege can look like. Right. So, and this is something that the Frederick Douglass talks about when he writes "My Bondage, My Freedom." W.E.B. Du Bois brings this question up in the opening pages of The Souls of Black Folk, and the question is this: that their very exemplarity, the fact of them being excellent, excellent examples of people who defy the stereotypes that structure hierarchies. makes them sort of, a double-edged sword, and an argument against redress. You've had this argument leveled against you many, many times, and in many, many different ways before and after the book. How do you see this duality, now having written this book, but also for those who might face it, and how they should reckon with it?
Yeah, I'm really glad you asked this question because this question is asked of me often, the question of Dalit privilege. And if we think about it, and I want to take this opportunity to address how offensive this question is, which is not to say you shouldn't have asked it. I'm really glad you did. But this is a question that is not just posed of me. Here, at least I have an opportunity to talk about it. But usually they're just said, people say this is a privileged Dalit person, therefore they don't have a voice. So my question is, who does have a voice? Somebody who can't speak for themselves, and therefore you can speak for them, and that is why they are the right person to have a voice. Anyone who has a voice, anyone who has been able to somehow break through these institutions, these barriers that are erected for us to not be a part of these spaces, suddenly they don't have a voice. If a person doesn't fit into the narrative of what a perpetual victim looks like, then they don't have a voice. And suddenly, then they have privilege. Well, the fact that when I came out as Dalit, there were four Dalit journalists who wrote in English, is that something that we call Dalit privilege? There is still no Dalit editor who runs any major newspaper in India. I mean, journalism in India is a completely different story. So let's not even go there right now. But despite that, is this what we are calling privilege, that we have a handful of Dalits who have material access to cars and resources that dominant caste people have had for generations? Is that how we define privilege? Or is it wrong for us to say that a huge part of our society is so discriminated and oppressed still, and we have the resources and the voice and the articulation to talk about it, and thus we are privileged? So isn't it a way for us to silence us regardless of what we say? If we have a voice, then we are too privileged. If we don't have a voice, then who cares what we have to say? It is me who is sitting here and talking to you, and not somebody else who is from rural India, who doesn't have the education or the ability to write this book, that is talking to you, right? So I think when we speak of privilege, that is something we need to really think about. Who are we lobbying this question against? And what does it speak of our biases? How do we expect Dalit people to be? Why do we only expect them to be one way or the other? Why do we only think a Dalit person should look broken for them to satisfy your idea of being magnanimous, that you gave them the space to be here?
And one of the other ways in which you sort of, you recount, you recount the hostility with which your success has been perceived, is around the question of reservations, and how, when the first sort of moment came for you to, to use the device that are reservations, you felt a sense of the, the tyranny of merit, to use, Michael Sandel's book title, that, that, and you situate this, the individually experienced tyranny, in the larger context of, sort of self-constructed castelessness of Savarna folks. And you tell the story of both of these registers. Do you see that as a sort of, as a continuation of the same story? What do you see as the horizons of reconciling the individual striving with the social project of reservations and affirmative action?
I think it's very important for us to look at reservations in the context. And, I want to say this is a question that has never stopped being asked from Dalit individuals who have a mic. Every time that we go anywhere, we are supposed to answer about how we got affirmative action, and therefore we were able to use it. So the fact that most of the Dalit narrative until 2016 centered and focused on reservations should be enough for us to understand how important dominant caste people think the subject is. The reason I launched Documents of Dalit Discrimination, which was a Tumblr website where I wanted to collect testimonies of Dalit trauma and Dalit pain and what we felt about caste, was because you only heard about reservation, whether it was, at the time of the construction of the country, or in the 90s when this question became so heated at the time of Mandal Commission, when dominant caste feminists came out on the streets and said, our husbands will not have good jobs if you extend affirmative action to oppressed caste people. Not to mention that the population percentage of people who access reservation and people who are in positions of power and opportunities are completely skewed. So the fact that, Dalit voices, people, writers, academics are constantly hounded, and not to say that's what you're doing, but this is an expectation that just because you're here, you have to justify your presence, that you were giving affirmative action, which is not to say that until 2 generations ago, my great grandfather couldn't lift a pencil. He couldn't touch a slate. He couldn't touch a book. My mother, when she learned Sanskrit and tried to speak it, was abused and met with violence. And that is why we needed affirmative action, without which I would never be in an institution like St. Stephen's, which is an extremely elitist institution in New Delhi. So the fact that after all those generational traumas and 3 generations later, I'm able to sit here, I'm able to be here, and my contemporaries, Dr. Suraj Yengre, who's from this institution, he's able to be here. It took us many, many generations to be here, where dominant caste people have had generations of being in Oxford, of being at Harvard, of being at all these institutions, and they're not asked about the private legacy reservation that they've had for many, many years. This is only a question that, because it's legally enshrined in the Constitution, we have to answer for the marginal crumbs of equity that have been thrown away in only government institutions.
And I think the book goes, the what the book documents is also how it was Savarna resistance to historical injustice that constrains the field like so, and then seeks to withdraw even from that, right? So in the way in which you present, the conflict over the fast that Gandhi undertook after the 1932 communal award, the reversal of the double vote, all of that presents the exact, the sort of the history and the context in which you narrate your own story. And I think it's a very helpful context also for audiences, particularly in the United States, right? Because while reservations, are cliche, and they're cliche when they're presented as, acknowledge your gratitude, do not enjoy it further. They're also a radical device that is certainly completely absent from America, and that's something you talk about in the sense that as a state-led measure, that's becoming an increasingly smaller form of affirmative action, and that leads us to the larger space, of private industry, where none of those protections are available and present. You've narrated what some of those experiences look like, which are in some sense the space where reservation does not mark out. Dalit, OBC, ST folks who have struggled and striven to get there, and have been marked by that status, and bullied for that status, driven out of institutions. What is the story of your experience in the private world of Indian casteism?
Yeah, I mean, when you talk about, how different affirmative action looks in the United States versus how radical the seemingly it seems in India, I think that is where we need to understand the danger of comparing India and the US when it comes to these two different structures of oppression. Structural violence looks very similar, but its manifestations and the contexts in which it originates are starkly different. India became a country in 1947. The 40s were an extremely optimistic time. If India was to position itself as a leader of that region, it had no other choice but to be progressive. And accepting Dr. B.R. Ambedkar's idea of affirmative action was one of the ways that country made that project happen. Whereas the US has a very different history. It is built on the labor of enslaved people. In 1947, there were Jim Crow laws in effect over here. They still don't have a female president. And because that is the contextual history of this country. So I think we have to be very careful and mindful when we say racism is casteism and vice versa, because it's not. They look different, literally. They're experienced differently, and they have originated in completely different contexts. So when it comes to, the private sector caste discrimination, I think in India, The fact that you even want to mention affirmative action in any sense is considered a slur. It's considered an offense to even bring up that Dalit people should be in spaces like journalism, in spaces like media, in spaces like architecture, in any other spaces that are not government owned. There is no Dalit presence, whether it's judiciary, or if you look at private sector in any way. Judiciary is obviously government based, but Dalits are not present in these spaces where affirmative action is not available. And even when it is, we know some of you might be aware of the case of Dr. Ritu Singh. She is a Dalit teacher right now. She is a Dalit professor who's striking against Delhi University, which is one of the biggest universities in Delhi, which is where affirmative action does exist. But she was discriminated precisely because she availed it, because she used a constitutional right of using affirmative action, of asserting her Dalitness, of not going with the nationalist project that is now imposed on India pretty much everywhere. She had been suspended and now she's striking, and it's been over 3 weeks that she's been doing that. So even spaces where affirmative action exists, Indian universities are notorious for gatekeeping higher positions from Dalit professors, for not releasing scholarships to Dalit students. So, when we have this situation, think about how difficult it must be to even to bring up this conversation in private sector. It is treated like, now you want reservation here also, you want to dilute this pristine pool of talent that we have made of just dominant caste people with your dirty Dalit entrance. We won't stand for that. And that is my experience of being in private spaces. I did not think I had the option to even say the word reservation. I was in hiding. I was hiding my caste. I was not openly Dalit when I was working in journalism spaces, because I knew the moment they found out who I was, my world would be totally different. So my experience with private sector reservation is none, because I that environment is so not conducive, because they feel that that is the temple of merit. And to think of it, look at where Indian journalism is now. That's the temple of merit.
I want to, I also, one of the things you describe about New York is how it became a space of freedom, and also became a space of flourishing, where in classroom settings and in workplaces, you found that you weren't shackled in nearly the same ways, but also it wasn't just an individual experience, but it was a collective experience of solidarity made possible by Black feminist movements, by various other different groups that were doing important work here. What would you say? What would you say groups in India that are involved in similar agitations can learn from these experiences?
I think there is so much to learn, because I mean, America, with the United States being the first world so-called quote unquote country that it is, with the history that it carries, and the space that it holds in the global order, has a very different impact. Whatever happens in the US immediately finds an audience everywhere else, whether it's, BLM, for example. We saw dominant caste Indians marching for BLM in the streets of India when they would never even include Dalit people in any of their pride marches. There was a pride parade in Mumbai, and Dalit people who wanted to carry posters of Dr. B.R. Ambedkar were told that they didn't belong there. But very same people, so many of them, marched for BLM, not probably because it was a cool thing to do. So I think we have to really unpack about this global currency, this cultural capital that has been generated out of protest movements, and how that translates to India, and how, especially with in the last 10 years, especially with the proliferation of internet, folks who are young Indians in their 20s have wholesale taken the Black experience, as of, in the US, and have just appropriated it. So I think one of the things that we can learn as movements who are building up is how organized this entire movement was, how they used cultural capital to create currency that was not given, whether it was through movies, whether it was through music, whether it was through fashion. And I've been a fashion journalist for a very long time, so I understand just how much power these soft currencies can carry. And I think, I mean, this is, I'm not sure if other folks will agree, but I definitely think there is so much for us to learn through how Black music is so deeply crucial to just defining American culture. Nobody could deny outside America that Americans feel proud of jazz, of blues, of hip hop now, right? I think it's important for Dalit culture, which is extremely varied. One of the issues that we face is that Dalit culture is not a monolith. We can't claim to be one people because we come from different regions, whether it's Rajasthan, Bengal, Maharashtra. We have our own cultures, but we can connect through music. We can connect through culture. We can connect through stories. That's important.
One of the things that's also really, besides the social science history and the first person narrative, is the other narratives and stories that you present. Documents of Dalit discrimination, but also the story of Rohit Vimula. And the way I see it is that the book collects both the sort of the influences that brought you to the point where you were comfortable announcing your identity, and also becoming someone who was comfortable facilitating the sort of the revolt of others, their identification with themselves, and their public declaration of it. What has the experience of that been like? Of course, you've got a lot of hate that that goes that's partly why this event is barricaded the way it is. But you've also made possible very different lives for very, very many people. And I think you should talk about that.
Yeah, no, thank you for saying that. I think, I just came in from New York this afternoon, and I was on my way from Brooklyn to the airport, and I saw this graffiti that said, "If you ain't got hate, you ain't poppin'." So I think that really sums up how I feel. And it was super early in the morning. It stayed with me. So um, I think when I decided to come out as Dalit, I was really under the impression of being somewhat naive about what this could look like now. And of course, you could never imagine when you just are starting a website what impact it could have. I had no idea what that form that could take. All I knew that I felt relatively safe. We talked about being in New York, the objective distance. And it's not just New York or the United States, it could be any other place that gave me the permission to feel that I wasn't forced by the weight of caste on my back at every minute, that I could put it down. In the book, I called it the carcass of caste that had fused with my back. I could put it down and I could finally separate it from myself and see who I was as an individual that was outside of my caste. So that was very important for me. And collecting these stories was a way for me to create that space that I never had. You know, um, when I came out as Dalit, as I'm sure all of you hopefully know, it was because of the last letter of Rohit Vemula, which is an extremely powerful document. If you haven't read it, my only reading recommendation is please go and do that. It is inarguably, the most important piece of work written in English by a Dalit person. And I think it deserves that kind of gravity and significance because of what that letter ultimately created. He talked about how his mind was made of stardust, and he didn't want he said, "I'm more than a vote, more than a number. I'm a man. I'm a man who dreams of stars, of stardust." And those lines are immortal because not just for me, but for hundreds and thousands of Dalit people across the world, they helped them. They were kind of a beacon, a signal that that it was shining this light on their own lives in a way that nothing else had done before. And it did that for me, and I felt that he paid the ultimate price for writing those words. Those were his last words. He was forced to take his own life, and it really forced me to reflect about, I was here with this my safe distance, and I'd led this life of privilege. um and how could I sort of not just carry on his legacy? That's not something I'm qualified to do, but just to make a similar contribution on just my own personal level. And which is why I thought, what is it that I can do as a journalist with all this training that I've had, which is to then talk about a space that was outside of this narrative of reservation, I was one of the earlier online journalists for HT, Hindustan Times in New Delhi. And every story that we had about caste, the only comments would be about reservation. And it was really demoralizing. So I wanted to create a space for people like myself who could not talk about caste, who didn't have easy access to Dalit movements, who lived in places like Rajasthan or Orissa or other parts of the country where Dalit movements are not that strong. And they can also access Baba Sahib B.R. Ambedkar, his work, his writings. They could talk about what it feels like to hide their identity. This was a narrative that just did not exist at that time, which is not to say people were not hiding their identities, but there was no vocabulary. And I really wanted to calcify it in words the way I was experiencing it. And I decided to write this note called Today I'm Coming Out as Dalit, and how I'm removing the shame that has been foisted on my identity as a Bhangi, man who's scavenging lower caste woman, and assuming the pride of the struggle that my ancestors have fought. And with that, I released that letter and I created documents of Dalit discrimination to invite other people to tell their stories. And of course, that generated a lot of hate. At that time in 2016, the hate wasn't about who I was, it was about what is coming out as Dalit. Today, some of you might know that it has become a term of contestation. At that time, everybody said that coming out as Dalit as a term makes no sense. It's completely nonsensical to use these words as any other context. I was questioned why I needed to hide my caste. There was, unfortunately, and I may admit that, not that much empathy for folks who didn't have easy access to Dalit movements in the same way other folks did. So I thought that if this was creating the reaction it did, and at the same time I was getting emails and Facebook requests and DMs from people who said that they felt seen for the first time, I'd done something right. So hate has been a part of my life as a woman journalist in an online space since I started writing. But from my work, it became to who I was. And that transference was painful and it has taken me a lot to deal with. But I think it also comes with this huge responsibility that I have this voice and there is nothing I can do about it. It's just out in the open. You can't put this back in the bag.
I think this is the perfect moment for you to read something for us. And I would also request if there are index cards around, then they can also make their way towards the front, and we can start sharing the conversation.
So, what I want to read for you is my author's note to this new edition. Coming Out as Dalit has been published since 2019, but I want to talk about why I wrote this book. And if you want a couple of minutes to collect the notes, I think we can do that.
We can do that at the end of the reading. Actually, let's do that now, and then
Sure.
give me time to decipher the handwriting. Please. Okay, this is a good set. Please, we should have the reading, and it will be uninterrupted.
Great. The book you're about to read was written under extraordinary circumstances, as most books typically are. Like many authors, I struggled to survive while writing, having immigrated to the US just months before starting this project and working multiple jobs during the day to find time to write in the evening. It was excruciating and laborious and took a lot longer than I expected. But like many books that should have always existed, but somehow didn't, this book too carried the urgency of molten lava that once started could not be contained. I needed to write coming out as Dalit. Even before I had any words typed on a laptop, I knew this book would never be mine alone. In the fiercely gate-kept space of Indian English language writing, where dominant caste literary stars were bursting almost daily, Dalits did not exist. Rare books that told our stories also never spoke to us. They addressed a reader who, with the objective distance of their dominant caste, could feign shock or anguish when encountered with the reality of our lived existence. Writing this book was the one shot to tell our stories in our own words. It was my window to communicate with the people who rarely got a chance to dream and imagine our own narratives without having to factor in the omnipresent, dominant caste reader of the Indian English literary canon, or even the first world reader of the Western literary canon. Dalits did not get to write books in English. Faced with the task of writing this rare book that, beyond the debut work of a journalist turned author, was an idea that had finally come alive for millions of us across the world, I wrote Coming Out as Dalit for Dalits.